Gang Roundtable. It is 1:11 p.m. Friday, June 5th, 2020. And we have Steve Marchand on the program. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks, guys.
So we are a basic income advocacy podcast. We talk about poverty, basic income, and electoral politics because the three are very tightly intertwined. If everyone would like to just very quickly say hello, introduce themselves, and then we'll get on with a Q&A. So starting with you, Angelo.
My name is Angelo Mendoza. You can find me on Twitter at Hellion Hellfire.
Thank you. My name is Shale. I'm one of the producers of the show, and my Twitter is at SHAELRILEY. Jeremy, my co-producer here.
Yes, this is Jeremy. You can find me on Twitter at Jeremy Sammons 1. That is JEREMYSAMMONS and the number 1.
Thank you. Jacqueline.
I'm Jacqueline Homan, and you can find me on Twitter at Jacqueline Homan.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
JACQUELINEHOMAN.
It's good to spell it. And Faye.
Hi, I'm Faye Koo, and you can find me on Twitter at Palestine Math.
Thank you, Faye. Also one of our producers. And so Steve Marchand. So without further delay.
Forgot me.
Oh, Ariel, you know what? And also Sheridan. I'm so sorry. I didn't see your cameras on. I mean, I didn't see you because your cameras are off. So hello, Ariel.
Oh, okay. Yeah. My name is Ariel, and you can find me on at Ariels_Armada. So I'll spell that ARIELS_ARMADA. And you can also find me on YouTube at youtube.com/revolutionary thinking.
And Sheridan. Sheridan, hello.
Yeah. Sorry, I was using the Discord hotkey instead of the Zoom hotkey. Yes, I'm Sheridan. Thank you, Shale. You can find me on Twitter at JSaberGamer, JSABERGAMER. I'm very excited to talk to Steve today.
Thank you so much. So Steve, in your own words, could you please, for everyone listening, just introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Steve Marchand, and my Twitter handle's at MarchandSteve. I'll spell that out. MarchandSteve. I'm a New Hampshire native who eventually moved to the seacoast in New Hampshire. I'm a first-generation American. Folks are from Quebec, English second language of the house. You're influenced by your childhood. We filed bankruptcy when I was in high school because my dad was self-employed as a carpenter, didn't have health insurance. It dropped it earlier because the economy had kind of splanked, just died on us. My mom had a heart attack at 39 years old, $50,000 medical bill. They said, you pay it or you file bankruptcy. We did. We filed bankruptcy. It's the number one reason people do. And that colors you for the rest of your life. It affected my parents for the rest of their working life. And it certainly affects the way I look at healthcare. It actually is part of what drives me about things like UBI, about rebuilding the social safety net, because we're all one emergency away from falling right into that net. Eventually went to Syracuse University, got a public administration, I got an MPA, audit cities for a living, city, county, and state governments. Eventually became mayor of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Ran for governor recently, finished second in the 2018 gubernatorial Democratic primary, got about 35%, about 42,000 votes, and made a lot of friends. And soon after, I met Andrew in, I think it was January of 2019. I had heard of him, but had not spent a lot of time, certainly not with him. By the end of it, I really liked him. I joke, I realized in 5 minutes, we got a 44-year-old first-generation American father of two who really likes math. Holy crap, that's me. And then from there, the policies. By April, I had signed on as sort of his national advisor, political and so forth. Traveled some of the country with him. Obviously, focused more on New Hampshire. We can get into the whole nitty-gritty of all that, which I think a lot of folks find kind of fun, like behind the curtain stuff. Not only did he become the guy that I wanted to be president very badly, he became a good friend. We're peers in a lot of ways, and I'm ride or die with Andrew going forward, and I think he has a lot of really exciting paths, political and maybe some not political in the near term. And that takes me to today. I'm married for almost 20 years. My wife, Sandy, and I have 2 teenage daughters who are just about to turn 17 and just about to turn 15. Both think they're 25. And I live in Northampton, New Hampshire, here on the seacoast.
It's really nice to meet you.
Well, nice to meet everybody here. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So what are you doing right now in terms of, after the campaign?
It's funny, after a campaign, when you get that invested in it, there's at least a small window. And I've worked on and off in politics. I've managed campaigns early in my career, and later was in elected office. You need to, what's the word? You just need to decompress in every way. Physically, it's a very demanding thing when you're neck deep in politics. Emotionally, everything. And obviously, we were disappointed that Andrew didn't go further in the process. So you need a few weeks to decompress. I went down to New York. I spent some time with Andrew and Zach, the national manager, talking about what happens next and just kind of decompressing about what had just happened. I had spent some time, frankly, getting together with my family because you're away from home a lot down the stretch. And then the pandemic hit, like right around the time that you would be doing the next things is when the world froze, right? I mean, weeks. It's when we think about it now, the New Hampshire primary was February 11th. He dropped out at the end of that night. By the time we were in New York, 2 weeks later, I think it was February 26th, right in Midtown Manhattan, riding the subway, getting on airplanes, Ubers and taxi cabs, lunch and busy, Midtown Manhattan, which is where Andrew and Zach and the remaining team were. But COVID was already ravaging parts of Midtown Manhattan by then. We just didn't realize it. And within a week or two of that, the world froze. So I've been working with New Hampshire political figures, friends of mine. I feel refreshed now, in terms of the presidential campaign experience, doing some of the auditing work that I mentioned earlier, kind of on the side, although for a lot of local governments in the near term, it's a very scary time in terms of state and local budgets because revenues have collapsed. So they need a different kind of consulting now. What's going to happen next at a time when demand for services is higher than ever, right? I mean, a lot of unemployed people, a lot of uninsured people, a lot of sick people. At the same time that revenues are collapsing. Recessions and depressions are particularly tough for governments because the time that you get the least money is the time where you have the most demand for resources. So some work on that. And as things open up more, we'll do more of the political thing this summer and fall and try to maintain some of that kind of work as well. But it was really intense to work with Andrew, and it needed a few weeks after to decompress, and that's when COVID took over the world.
Man, I don't know about you, man, but it feels to me it's like February seems like it was like 10 fucking years ago, but it was really just a few months. Everything is
time is relative. Quickly. Yeah, the perception
Angelo,
of time is relative.
I see you've got a something to add. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you mentioned about revenues collapsing, and this was something I wanted to ask, just calculating out UBI for my own state. Considering Arizona is very rural, we may be a little bit different from where you're at. But do you believe that a universal basic income would actually increase revenues through state and local taxes and actually help rural communities become more solvent?
Well, I mean, and this is going to sound like I'm parroting Andrew, and perhaps I am, but we're wired the same way. We have spent so much money at the federal level in the last 3 months trying to figure out a way to bridge the gap when we basically have asked the private sector to largely shut down in a way to try to limit the spread of COVID. But at the same time that we did that, for a big swath of the population, we haven't really told them how we are going to make up for the fact that we have mandated that they have to close down their life. This is where UBI was very logical, and it's also part of the reason because it is such a logical part of getting money in the hands of people that will then do many of the things that will allow rent to get paid, food to remain on the table. It has the indirect effect of helping buttress payrolls by obviously putting money directly in the hands of people in lieu of employers being able to do so. Virtually everything that these other programs or proposed programs at the federal level have attempted to do, sometimes quite inelegantly and inefficiently, could have largely been done in a far more efficient fashion by just putting something along the lines of $2,000 a month in every adult hands and $1,000 a month in every minor's hands. That would have had the effect for, for a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, for example. When you're putting $6,000 a month, you're really at a place where in most cases, now we can talk about taking care of a mortgage or a rent. We can talk about making a car payment. We can talk about putting groceries on the table. You're now at a place for that family where the 4 or 5 biggest staples of daily life that just need to happen to allow life to continue can now get covered. And now you talk about the PPP program, which was to help with payrolls for smaller businesses. If you augment a few of the proposals, which were generally good ideas, with a UBI type thing, I think we'd be in a much stronger position than we are right now. And I do worry that we're kind of limping along without a real long-term strategy for the country. And we got to do better than just, well, I hope we get a vaccine soon. I mean, I feel like that's sort of where we're at as a country. And of course, I mean, I do blame the current lack of leadership in the White House. But it's not just Donald Trump. That's too simple. I wish that the Democratic response included a unified voice on things like UBI. I think that would have put more public pressure, and Andrew's been doing his part on that. But, and by the way, people like Ro Khanna have been doing their part on it. There's a growing number. I mean, even people like Mitt Romney, not the same, but, even Josh Hawley and the plan he's talking about in Missouri, there are some really exciting moves towards the Yang agenda from both sides of the aisle that have occurred because of this pandemic. As he says, what we thought was going to take 10 years ended up taking 10 weeks. But UBI is the obvious answer to act as the bridge. And then obviously once we stabilize, I think also people would realize UBI is a hell of a good idea after the pandemic as well. We can talk about what levels the number should be, but I mean, that's the path. And I still have some hope that we've made such progress on UBI over the last year or so that by 2024, if not earlier, it will be a central plank of the majority of state Democratic parties and multiple presidential candidates.
So Steve, in New Hampshire, how many pro UBI people do you have there when we're talking in terms of mayors like you, the governor, the state senator, and the Congress people of New Hampshire?
It's funny. Elected officials generally don't lead, they follow. I mean, Andrew used to say, you've probably all heard the story where he went to Washington, talked to an unnamed congressman, and the congressperson said, listen, Andrew, you don't get it. Things don't happen here in Washington. They happen around the country, and you have to form a wave that will wash on top of Washington and cause the elected officials to make big things happen because of the pressure. And then Andrew says, okay, and I went back and he basically was like, it's on. And that's what got him going. So public polling of a UBI plan in New Hampshire shows that a strong majority of the overall population, including a very large majority of Democrats and almost 2/3 of undeclared voters, what we call undeclareds, independents in New Hampshire, are in favor of UBI, and a growing number of Republicans are as well. But in terms of current elected officials, like state senators, members of Congress, they are, I'll be candid, a lot of them are friends, but they are much slower to that. And I will say, when I joined Andrew's campaign, they looked at me like I had 3 heads. They were all like, we're going to go with senators and congressmen and governors. And then all of these folks that at the beginning were like, you're crazy. your boy is going to be out by June of last year. And they'd be like, Cory Booker's going all the way. Kirsten Gillibrand's going all the way. John Hickenlooper and Jay Inslee and, Kamala Harris. And one of the things that all those people had in common and more is they didn't get to New Hampshire. And by the way, a lot of good candidates there. But people were not reading that the country is in such a place of transition right now. It is so chaotic. This was true 2 years ago. And the reason Trump got elected is because we're in this elbow of transformation that we've not yet gotten to the other end of yet. And I tell folks all the time, and it's part of what I genuinely see in Andrew, every 40 years in this country, there's a transformative moment. And it gets really messy at the end of that 40 years or so. And then we've been lucky, or maybe it's inevitable, that eventually a president comes in who's transformational in nature, whether we like the transformation or not. So it was Lincoln in 1860. It was Teddy Roosevelt around 1900. It was FDR in 1932. It was Ronald Reagan in 1980. These people basically said, I'm building a new coalition, a Reagan Democrat, for example. That was a Democrat until they felt like the Democratic Party wasn't representing them the way they wanted. They became open for business. Ronald Reagan came in with an agenda that was far, far more conservative than what the Republican Party had been even for the last 40 years. It was bold. As a lifelong Democrat, it's not my cup of tea, but it was big and transformational, and it required big personalities. It met the moment. And what I'm telling you is we're way overdue for the next transformational moment in the country's history. And right before it happens, it gets really messy. Shit gets real. I mean, Jimmy Carter became president by a hair over Gerald Ford because of Watergate. And that 4 years of Carter, an honorable man, but Carter was a transitional president. He was not a transformational president. The country was trying to figure it out. Right before FDR, you had Harding and Coolidge and Hoover. This was the end of an ideological era, and it took when FDR was ready to rock and roll and the country was lined up for him. Boom, it went there. Teddy Roosevelt was the end of a period that included some of the most forgettable presidents. Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland and Garfield and McKinley. These are rather forgettable presidents. It took boom. And I think Trump is not a transformational figure. He's a transitional figure while we're getting our shit together. And I think nobody's going to say that Joe Biden is a transformational president. By his own account, he says he's a transitional figure. His own words. I'm not dissing him. He says, I am a transition to the next generation of politicians. His words. So that means that whether it's in 2024 or 2028, there will almost certainly be a transformational president elected. And I just want to do whatever I can, and I suspect you do too, for that person to be somebody who is transformational the way that Andrew would have clearly been, rather than somebody who might be transformational in the way that, Reagan ended up being, in a more ideologically conservative, all government is bad, small government is bad direction. And that's the debate that we're going to have as a country in the next 4 to 8 years. Trump is not what the future of America looks like. He's the representation of what happens when America doesn't have his shit together, but hasn't figured out where it wants to go when it grows up yet.
Jacqueline, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, I'd like to expand a little bit. Humor me on this. What Reagan wasn't for, he wasn't conservative, because they were very comfortable with big government, as long as it was big government that was working in their favor. What they were against was, this is what neoliberalism is. What they were opposing was a government that worked for us. Okay. That's where I think things went down the wrong path and kept accelerating at a dangerous rate. There was nothing conservative about taking away food from the poor, or slashing the budget of HUD, which Reagan did, among many other things, while at the same time, getting involved in these arms scandals and then funding the wars down in Latin America and Nicaragua and, the Sandinistas and all that nonsense that, he had done. these guys didn't have a problem with big government so long as it was big government that served them. Just saying.
Yeah, and one thing that he did, I don't disagree with what you said, is language obviously matters, and he redefined what conservatism was going to be. So, for example, deficits were bad until they were deficits related to growing the military-industrial complex. Then deficit's not so bad. But somehow, and I think this is something Andrew and I talked a lot about, the conservative movement framed the way that they framed, I hear what your points are, has owned certain words and ideas. And I'll give you one. I would argue universal basic income plus Medicare for all plus a pro-immigration stance, the positive power of immigration, is the most pro-entrepreneur set of policies that one could create. It puts money in the hands of people that recirculate it in the local economy. It detaches private insurance from employers. And nobody ever starts a business with the dream of spending all their time and money figuring out how they're going to provide insurance for their workers. They didn't do that to deal with the bureaucracy and the headaches and the challenge of having to decrease the value of people's insurance every year to try to minimize the increase in their premiums. This is the reality of our unusual system that is 70 years out of date. But it's also anti-entrepreneur because people are afraid to leave a business to start their own business. The most American and entrepreneurial of ideas, because they don't have insurance tethered to that. It just stops growth and entrepreneurship and innovation in its tracks. And then immigration is the big thing. We know that, and as the child of immigrants, their children and their grandchildren wildly start businesses at higher rates than people not in those 3 generations of immigration. The mere act of immigration is itself an entrepreneurial act because it's hard, it's scary, it's sort of risky in its own way. It's an entrepreneurial act. And so to me, what I feel like the Democratic Party, frankly, any party, I mean, Republican, whoever, in this case, Andrew, was I want my fellow Democrats to take back the word entrepreneurship, which has become sort of this Republican conservative word. And I'm like, yeah, but you're killing entrepreneurship. It's down 40% relative to the growth of the economy, the size of the economy since 1980, not coincidentally when Reagan got elected. And by being anti-universal health insurance mindset, by being against UBI, by being anti-immigration in deed and in word, these are you're killing entrepreneurship. And that's where 90% of net new jobs get created in this country by young and new businesses, not established businesses. And I think that Andrew understood that, articulated that well. And it's part of the reason why he generated a lot of interest among people that really wouldn't give other Democrats the time of day during the presidential primary process.
So I'd love to hop in here just for a moment because both myself and Sheridan are actually small business owners and entrepreneurs. And one thing about UBI that makes an amazing difference for us is, especially in this time of COVID, being small business owners, is we don't know if our customers are coming back because, well, we're having to keep our businesses afloat on the credit card. So is every single one of our customers. They are surviving by going into debt. So they're going to have less free capital to be able to spend on businesses like mine and Sheridan's until they're able to pay off that debt, and they don't know when that's going to happen. A UBI would mean that we have ready customers on day one. They would be able to actually, patronize our businesses. They would be able to get the economy roaring again. And when people don't accumulate debt, they're able to spend on things they need, and especially, when they have something left over, things they want. There's a saying with among entrepreneurs, you don't start a business by pumping a dry well. And that's exactly what's happening now. We're sitting here trying to pump a dry well where no one has jobs and saying, well, everyone just gets back to work and it's all going to be fine. It's not. And the numbers have shown that it won't be fine for a while until people are able to feel secure enough after they've paid off, a significant amount of debt to be able to actually participate in the market.
One point, Angelo, this is an important point, I think. When I was a mayor, I used to deal a lot with land use policy. It turns out in local government, the most powerful person in your community is often not the mayor or the chair of the school board. It's often the chair people on the local land use boards who are zoning, planning board, board of adjustment. These folks, when you go to make a proposal to do something to your home or your commercial building, their approval or disapproval of it could actually make the difference in the future of your household and your business. So I dealt with them a lot. And I would deal with a lot of business leaders who owned a lot of property in Portsmouth. We're really a hub of commercial business in northern New England. We're right on the seacoast on I-95. We have more restaurant seats than we have residents. And we're one of the best small cities in America. We regularly are in the top 10 best small cities to live in America and so forth. These are conservative, libertarian, like almost libertarian kind of conservative. And they would say, Steve, I don't care what kind of regulation you put in, what the tax rates are, or the code, the property tax rate, whatever. Just give me predictability, because they would tell me the ultimate enemy of being able to start and grow and maintain a successful business is the predictability of the rules of the road, which gets back to, if you don't know how much money is coming in next month, you spend less. Even if the money ends up coming in okay, if you have unpredictability as to your revenue streams or for household income streams, if you have unpredictability about what your insurance is, will you have it? What will it cover? How much will I pay out of my pocket in a copay or caps, deductibles? If you don't know that, you have to pull back, even if you have resources today. And I think that, and this is true in a number of areas. So I think a lot of folks intuitively feel so uncertain about what their job prospects are going to look like. Just before this call, I'm on a committee locally on the seacoast of restaurateurs and small retailers in Portsmouth who are trying to, how do we reopen the greater Portsmouth area? So I'm on the committee. And the restaurateurs are like, we got some people saying, fully open the inside of the restaurants, we need to fill it. To which they're like, 70% of people in polls in New Hampshire say they are not comfortable eating inside a restaurant. You can open the restaurant. You can have people sit next to each other again. But if they're not comfortable going in, they're not going to. But then so like we're in a very unstable time. And this is part of why I think UBI uniquely would have provided this stability, this floor for households that would have really buttressed certain kinds of economic activity. Because at a minimum, a family of four, which is not, of course, the only family in America, but it's one that people get their head around, $6,000 a month before we even talk about whether or not one of the two adults has a job, whether or not they can cut some other kinds of whatever. That's going to keep things going, and that's going to cause some spending to occur. And because we don't have that, I think we're having an elongated period of instability, which is going to be very detrimental to the economy well into 2021.
That's why Angelo is part of a group called Gang Goes to Congress. And we are trying to testify before Congress. We've gotten ourselves an invitation. Is that right, Angelo?
Oh.
We're
yes,
going to be testifying for
yeah.
a recurrent cash payment, because the one cash stimulus is not stability. If you know there's only one, that's telling you it's not coming again. So immediately you're in scarcity mode, and right after you get it.
Yeah, it was actually on this podcast that we got the invitation from Congressman Tim Ryan. And yes, we're testifying for emergency UBI, which will lay the groundwork, I hope, for an eventual permanent UBI, because once people experience having that stability, having that monthly check come in where they know that their bills are met, they're not going to starve to death, they're going to be able to, afford their car payment, it's not going to get repoed, people are going to actually spend. And I feel like once local towns, governors, going all the way up the chain of command to, Congress, start to see the benefits of UBI in their state, they're not going to want to let that go, because they're going to see the economy start to boom in ways that it wouldn't ordinarily, and they're not going to shoot a recovery in the foot. Well, I don't know about the president, but anyone that is looking at this logically is not going to give up that huge boost.
So
I think the
I wanted
lobbyists,
to-
the business leaders too, they would also want to support that huge boost. Yeah, please go on, Faye.
No, it's great. I'm glad you chimed in. I wanted to also give you some good news for everybody who's listening. Because I've been participating as a delegate to the state convention, the state Democratic Convention in Texas. We're nearing the end of our convention days. It was a whole 6 days. It was a virtual convention, but a lot of work is still getting done. And we are bringing that blue wave crashing down. So we've got UBIs it made it into the Texas platform for the big vote. And we are voting on it today. The vote is happening at 10 p.m. And in general, most of these votes, since it's for the entire platform, are just going to go through, because we all sent delegates, and our Senate districts are, the delegate says yes, right? They participated. So hopefully, it made it in 2 different ways. Do you guys mind if I share the screen for just a minute? Or
Please do.
We're not going to do that.
Sure.
Go ahead.
It's disabled at the moment,
I'll
but
put
I
it-
can
okay.
just. I can just let you know that it was actually adopted in 2 different places. Okay, so in one place it says I couldn't find it at first. I was like, oh no, it didn't make it, right? But actually it made it in 2 different places, and the first one was under Social Security and Retirement. So, right, I was looking under economic policies or whatever, but I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. It is a Social Security. So it says here now, support in addition to the existing Social Security system, a system for universal basic income, which would cover all adults within the jurisdiction of the United States in light of the historic job displacement resulting from COVID-19 and continued advances in technological automation, and in recognition of unsustainable levels of income inequality. So, and then the second place it appears is under, some information about Asian American Texans under the sort of the racial equality piece. And it says under Asian American Texans, it says appreciate and teach Asian American contributions to American society, such as knitting the country together with the Transcontinental Railroad and pioneering universal basic income. So I found that to be really interesting that it was adopted in 2 different places. And, so with this, I'm wondering, can we convince more Democrats to actually run on the policy of UBI? Because I believe a lot of them are for it technically, but they're afraid to say so. Just like you were saying before, like they're going to follow us. Do you think that will be sufficient, or what do we need to do to get them to just come out for it?
Well, one of the steps, and I think that as we go into the summer and fall, Andrew is the obvious primary face of the UBI movement among candidates. But to the extent, and I'm advocating for this within the world of the Yang Gang, advocating for Andrew to find opportunities this summer and fall to go out into the land politically in a socially distant way, but to begin to go out there and actually make stops in some of the states, swing states with interesting state Senate and state rep elections. We're almost on the primary season in most states. And I know that a lot of the candidates that Humanity Forward has formally endorsed, that Andrew has endorsed, that the Yang Gang's gotten excited about for a number of congressional seats, those primaries are nearing their conclusions now. And I think, if we're being honest, in most cases, they're insurgent candidates, often taking on incumbent Democrats, and we're in real uphill fights and made a real dent and moved the ball forward, but were unable to win their primaries because they were running against incumbents. I think, but their efforts made progress. In New York, we have multiple primaries coming up in a few weeks that will, test the limits of UBI, but they all move the ball forward because they're getting more and more attention. Once the primaries are over, and New Hampshire, by the way, our primary is until September. We have the second latest primary in the country. We have our presidential primary very early, but that's not when we do our state primaries. Because it would be too early for a state primary. So we're one of the only ones that have kind of a separate date, super early for the presidential. And that's the only thing we vote on that day. And then everybody else, Senate, governor, Congress, state house, state Senate, all that stuff we do super late. I think it's September 10th this year. But in the states, once we have nominees, I'm strongly encouraging Andrew to look at state rep and state Senate candidates, because that's where the change is going to happen most quickly, I think. There aren't a lot of gubernatorial elections, for example, this year in the country. There are only 11, I believe. In most of those cases, the incumbent is in very strong shape. And so there isn't really a competitive pressure. There's only 2 or 3. Montana's one of them. North Carolina might be one of them. New Hampshire may or may not be one of them. It's not looking at the moment that competitive. COVID is freezing incumbents in place right now with high popularity. But I think that if Andrew can get out in the landscape and campaign actively for candidates, it can help them do everything from raise money to earn media attention to getting the yang gang on the radar screen of those candidates so that we can help support them in a variety of ways with phone banking, small dollar donation, social media awareness, not just for 2020, but for 2022 and 2024. We have to look at this as a multi-election cycle effort. If Donald Trump gets reelected, I have little doubt that Andrew will be running again in 2024. And if Joe Biden is elected, I have little doubt that Andrew will be offered a meaningful opportunity within the administration, probably in some role that focuses on the economy and being involved in that way. So I think that no matter what happens with this election, Andrew is going to be in an increasingly high-profile position, whether it's in national government or as an expected candidate for president who will start exponentially ahead of where he started last time. I mean, it's not even comparable. And that's 5 months from now. So the next 5 months, let's support candidates, particularly down ballot candidates, get them as far as we can, and then have them join the Yang Gang in active ways. These are the people that if they win or not, can really be district or statewide leaders, either in a formal campaign in 2024, or at least can be the spokespeople to help recruit other people in 2022 elections. This is how we really build what they call the grass tops. And I think some of these folks that are running for Congress, even if they don't win, they represent the grass tops of 2022.
So there is a very strong push right now for the UBI candidates, and I'm seeing that happening. I'm wondering what's happening with the platforms in different states. Like, is there any push to get resolutions through in other states to change the platform, amend it in multiple states? So then I don't know what's going to happen when we go to the national level. Who's going to be shepherding that?
Can't speak for obviously all the states. I'd be lying to you if I said that I followed the progress of UBI and the state platforms around the country. I know, for example, in New Hampshire, while they were not comfortable being explicit about UBI as an element of the platform standalone, UBI, there were 2 things I can tell you. One is, I was surprised how many non-Yang Gang in some of the meetings that I attended. I'm a delegate to the state committee, and some of the work I do now were very favorable towards UBI, and they give Andrew 100% of the credit. I mean, he did, I think, 34 visits to New Hampshire as a candidate, some of them 1 day, some of them 4 days. I mean, he was here, I think by the end of it, the second most of any candidate. I think John Delaney actually might have been here the most because he started running in like 2003 for president or something. He was here a long time. And he made a lot of friends. Andrew's challenge, I think it's important. By the end of it, his net favorability was among the highest in the field. So he started as a completely anonymous person. By the end of the process in New Hampshire, when you take the favorable and you subtract the unfavorable, he was in the top 2 or 3 with Bernie, Warren. I mean, he was right there with the biggest names because his unfavorables were under 10%. Activists really liked the guy. And by the end of it, the challenge was not, do you like Andrew Yang? First of all, the first challenge was, do you know who Andrew Yang is? Answer, no, they didn't. Second, I know who he is. Do you like Andrew Yang? They're like, I like this guy. You know what? UBI, I'm down with that. I mean, the progress was amazing. There was a third step that we could not get to. Are you ready for this guy that you've never heard of, like 7 months ago, who's talking about UBI that you also had never heard of 7 months ago? Are you ready for him to be commander-in-chief? And there were a lot of folks that are so worried about beating Trump in the activist space that at the end of the day, and obviously I have some deep concerns because I'm an Andrew guy, so I don't agree with this mentality, that they needed to keep it conventional. A U.S. senator, well, a former vice president, you get the idea. It's probably the thing that prevented Buttigieg from doing even better, is that there was a certain percentage that felt like he was a little too unconventional a resume, too young, a mayor to be. And we found that there were people that were like, it's between Yang, Bernie, and Warren. And what they eventually found is they wanted a revolution, but they felt like Bernie's resume was conventional enough that, you know, they could handle a revolution with somebody who'd been in federal office 30 years. And for Warren, she ended up collapsing in New Hampshire. She and Biden actually did quite poorly. And it was Klobuchar and Bernie, and to some extent Pete, who ended up gathering the last minute support. So we feel like Yang in 2024, if it's 2024, he starts with name ID and extreme favorability. And now people see that his ideas would be pretty friggin' awesome right about now. And that the way that we're going to beat Donald, the way to beat Donald Trump, Donald Trump is a complete outsider who is incompetent. What we need is a complete outsider who's incredibly competent. And that's actually kind of the sweet spot of America right now. And that's not quite what we're giving them. Biden is very competent. Like, he knows stuff. He's obviously not an outsider. And the Democratic base decided that instead of focusing on Trump as the outsider thing, like outsider was his asset, they decided as a group that his unconventionalness was a problem, not a solution. So they were going to go with the opposite, an extremely stable, conventional pick. We're going to find out in 5 months if that was right. Obviously, I have some I'm a little anxious about it.
Did you tell them that, like, Andrew was getting like the most amount of people who supported Trump before? I mean, it amazed me. It's like, yeah.
The day that I decided to go from I like this guy to I'm all in for Andrew, like like I'll be one of the faces of the whole thing, which I got a lot of crap for it at the beginning. I had run for governor the year before. I'd gotten a lot of votes. People see me as somebody who might run again in the near future for stuff. As seen as somebody who was an outsider, in a lot of ways, but is legitimized, broadly speaking, politically because of some relative success on a statewide level. So those kind of people aren't supposed to go with Andrew Yang, right? They're supposed to go with, depending on your cup of tea, Bernie, Warren, Biden, safer. And I'm like, listen, guys, when you get to know Andrew, anything close to the way I'm getting to know Andrew, you're going to see why this guy is the real thing and is actually the perfect match. And the day that I decided I got to put it all in, Andrew and I hadn't signed up, and I said that I would take him on a tour of the North Country of New Hampshire. We went snowmobiling. We did some meet and greets, like a 2-day trip as part of like a 3-day trip they did. And I got family. I'm from Southern New Hampshire, but my whole family's from Quebec. So most of my relatives that are no longer in Canada are in the northernmost county, which it borders Canada. And so it's home. It's a second home for me. A lot of friends, a lot of family. We did campaigning. At the end of the trip, we go to Plymouth, New Hampshire, which is kind of a small college town. It's sort of northern, but it's more central. It's the bottom of northern New Hampshire. We thought we'd have 20 people. We were going to do a book talk. Andrew and I were going to get 2 armchairs, and we were going to do it live on Facebook Live on my political page. Great. We show up. C-SPAN shows up, which we didn't know. And they're like, hey, you mind if we're going to do it? We're like, that's great. You can go on C-SPAN, by the way, and if you Google like Yang's last name and my last name, you'll probably find this broadcast. And it was awesome. I mean, it was laid back. We had the book. We talked all through. This was like late March of last year. We get like 90 people to show up. I'm like, who the hell are all these people? It's snowing outside. It's like 22 degrees. Who the F is Andrew Yang? Who the F is Steve Marchand, really? And we're sitting there. We're getting all these views on the program. And I look at the crowd. I'm seeing MAGA hats. I'm like, who are you? And I'm seeing Gary Johnson voters. I'm seeing tons of Trump. I'm seeing Hillary. I'm seeing Bernie. I'm seeing people that never voted before. And I'm seeing people that said they were never going to vote again. I'm seeing everything. And I looked at this diversity of ideology. And I'm like, this in here somewhere is the transformational coalition of what the next generation is going to look like when the shit is put together. But it was almost like our little secret, because we're in this like back room that was too small, right? Because we didn't know of all these people. And Andrew did a great job. I would urge you to watch it. I think it's actually one of the more enjoyable. It was 90 minutes. We just kept going. C-SPAN covered the whole thing. He did the Q&A. He was great. And by the way, he was so much better by 8 months later than he was that night, because he did it hundreds of times. But you could see the talent, authenticity, the diversity of ideology that was into him. I feel more strongly now than I did even that day in March, but I knew that day, as did others. Like, you know what? This is the guy. Like, if we're actually if we're trying to get some shit done, we found the guy. It was an exciting night.
Well, the really interesting thing for me is that there are still people who don't know who Andrew Yang is after this entire year of debates and all the, uproar, and being Yang Gang, we kind of forget that. So the other day we had someone hop on with us, a special guest, and somewhere in the middle of the broadcast, suddenly he says, who is this Yang guy you keep talking about? I went like, what? He says, well, we didn't vote. Nobody voted for him over there in Oregon, and so I think it's because their primary was later and he'd already suspended and everything. So we really have a lot of work ahead of us. We have a goal of growing 10 times, right? From the 5 to 6% we seem to constantly be stuck at, even though we felt like some polls were showing us at much higher levels. So, but the people who actually turned out to vote in the early states and then in other places, lots of places, we were really stuck. And so I'd like to find out if we've done a real postmortem from the campaign, because sometimes in the grassroots people, we don't feel like we've fully been able to voice our concerns about what was happening during the campaign up towards, the people who are the leaders, because they are so busy. They just don't have time to hear from everybody.
Well, now, and I say this as somebody who's obviously a New Hampshire resident, native, so I'm a bias alert. Right? However, I can tell you, if you go back to last fall, like last October, there was a shift in resources from what was going to be primarily a New Hampshire-centric early state strategy to what was an Iowa-centric early state strategy. Obviously, I was one of the people that was not in agreement with that. And there are a few reasons for it that are lessons that I don't feel like I'm speaking out of school, because Andrew has spoken about this publicly, I believe on CNN, among other places. So this is nothing that he has not touched on. Couple problems. One is New Hampshire is an ideal early state for a guy like Andrew. The history of our state, the plurality of our voters are undeclared. We have more undeclared voters than either Democrat or Republican. You can register on election day to vote in the New Hampshire primary. And we have a history of voting for outsiders. Gary Hart beat Walter Mondale in a landslide in 1984. Jimmy Carter won New Hampshire in 1976. In 1992, Paul Tsongas won the primary. People think it was Bill Clinton. It was not. It was Paul Tsongas. In 2000, John McCain crushed Governor George W. Bush. He actually lost registered Republicans by a point, but he won registered undeclared who pulled the Republican ballot by 35 points, and it caused him to win by almost 20. And the McCain Express, I mean, that's where it came from, or else he was going to drop out that night. Bernie Sanders in 2016 crushed Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump crushed the field, including John Kasich, who we thought might do well here in 2016. Eugene McCarthy effectively ended LBJ's ideas of running for a second full term. I mean, we can go all the way through. This is who New Hampshire is. In Iowa, you don't quite have that kind of history. And so an outsider is a much more attractive place in New Hampshire generally as a candidate in either party than Iowa. That's point one. And when we pulled away from New Hampshire, money, advertising, staff levels, and de-emphasize it and moved it to Iowa, clearly that's one decision. Here's the second one. In Iowa, as you may know, it's there's this viability idea. If you don't get 15% of a precinct, then you have to take the people that did support your candidate, and they either need to leave or they need to reorganize and go to another campaign that did get 15% that night in that gymnasium or whatever. And there's almost 2,000 precincts in the state. So it's really an organizing job more than like a TV job. Well, here's the problem. And I worked in a campaign. I actually worked for Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, in 2007. He was a very good candidate. He just ran the same year as Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John Edwards. Pretty tough field. He was creeping up in the polls, and they too fell into the Iowa trap. He was at 4%. Then he got to 7, 8. Our internal poll showed him getting around 9. Here's the problem in Iowa. If you show up on caucus night and you're at 11 or 10 or 9%, you might as well be at 0, because if you don't hit 15, you're not viable. And then all your reporters have to scatter to their second choice. And so I told them this on our national campaign. Unless you really feel like you can get close to 15% by caucus night in a lot of precincts, if you're at 11, you might as well be at 0, and it's going to basically render all the resources and the work moot. And indeed, that's what happened. We ended up getting, I think, 1.2% of the delegates because we didn't get to 15 anywhere. But our internal polling showed that we were getting up to high single digits as a state and low double digits in many precincts. But without getting to 15, whatever. Whereas in New Hampshire, if you get 10%, you get 10%. Like it's an election like most of us think of an election. You go into a polling booth, you do your private vote, they count it, that's the result. So Andrew has acknowledged that an Iowa-centric strategy for both those reasons was not a good match for him or anybody like him. And then the second thing is, I cannot reiterate this enough. Never in the history of the modern presidential races have we had somebody remotely like Andrew Yang get to even as far as he did. The handful of people that had never run for or held office before were generally some of the most famous and or richest people in the world: Trump, Perot, Eisenhower, so forth. Or if they were people that started low and worked up, they generally had a specific set of circumstances that got them there. Like the Jimmy Carter example might be the best one. He ran in a year where nobody could get to 20%, but he had been a governor and a state senator he had been planning to run for governor for 6 years, if you read his biography.
Didn't Jimmy Carter actually did the Iowa strategy though, didn't he?
He did.
He pioneered it
in Iowa. Oh, well, okay, a couple things. So one thing about Carter in Iowa, it's great. I love this stuff. And there's things you can learn even 40 years later that can help you figure out what to do or not do. So Carter didn't win Iowa, right? He finished second to Uncommitted. It's the last time that Uncommitted won a caucus because nobody knew who these candidates were. It was Birch Bayh, Scoop Jackson. There were a handful of others that ran. None of them were wow. And Carter, who was a political animal, smelled blood in the water. He saw this was an opportunity for a complete outsider in the wake of Watergate in a really weak Democratic field to go get it. And he focused on Iowa, and then he did focus on New Hampshire, and he saw Iowa as the slingshot that could take him into his really good infrastructure in New Hampshire and then take it from there. And it worked for him, but he didn't get much more than about 20% in either of the first two states. And what I was pitching in for Andrew was, if you pretend Iowa doesn't exist, then you cannot be seen as a disappointment for your finish in Iowa. And we have examples. John McCain skipped Iowa both times. He skipped it, just skipped it. And he focused all those additional resources on New Hampshire. Now it puts more risk on New Hampshire, right? If you say I'm putting all my chips into New Hampshire and then you don't do well, game over. But what my argument is, all the candidates ended up focusing on New Hampshire. Think about that. Like if you look at where they put their resources, Klobuchar was Iowa or bust. Bernie was one of the few that had the money to do both, but he spent way more time in Iowa down the stretch. Warren, even the ones that dropped out. I mean, Kamala Harris was caught on a hot mic, like around September of last year, saying, "I'm effing moving to Iowa," and Booker and Beto and all of them. They all decided Iowa was the place you had to put all your poker chips. But here's the irony, guys. If everybody focuses on the same place, you create a wild market inefficiency for success in the other place because there's no competition. And so let all these people in Iowa like all say, if I don't finish in the top 5, I'm out. And I'm like, well, guys, if there's 12 people saying, if I don't finish in the top 5, I'm out, at least 7 of you are going to be very disappointed. So the more people that were putting their chips into Iowa, the riskier putting your chips in Iowa was becoming, and the more expensive. Meanwhile, New Hampshire was sitting there. It's kind of like, the good-looking person that nobody would ask to the prom because everybody was focused over here, and you're sitting there going, there's a very good date for the prom sitting right there, folks. And we did put resources here, but at one point we were going to put about 120 full-time staff in New Hampshire, and that number sort of petered out around 45. And that obviously has an impact on your phone banking, your door-to-door, and so forth.
So Tulsi Gabbard went really hard in New Hampshire. It didn't exactly work out too well for her. Do you have any insight to where her campaign went wrong and why she didn't perform as well as she expected to?
Yeah, so you're right. Tulsi was the one candidate. Michael Bennett sort of did, but it was a little different. Tulsi was the one person who pretty early said, I'm putting all my chips into New Hampshire. And I knew her, she had a very limited staff, and they acknowledged the sort of market inefficiency opportunity, as well as New Hampshire's tradition of embracing outsiders. And Tulsi certainly was coming at this as an outsider in many ways relative to most of the field. What was Tulsi's problem? By the way, Tulsi beat us. So I'm not criticizing Tulsi. She got more votes than Andrew. And she did, despite having a tiny fraction of the money that we raised. We raised $40 million. Tulsi raised, I don't have the number in front of me, but it was a tiny fraction of that. She had we only had 40 some odd staff, but that was a tiny fraction. But that was far larger than Tulsi was in the single digits. And she got more votes than us. So I would argue to some extent, in an odd way, she was an example of what the upside could have been for a well-funded candidate that for a little while, polling in the late 2019, there were internal and external polls in late November into December that showed Andrew kind of bouncing up. We had some polls that showed him at 8 or 9% in New Hampshire as his favorables were flying up. We saw Warren starting to drop. We saw Bernie plateauing. And I personally saw a scenario where maybe if we could get Yang to about 22, it might have been like a Carter 76 kind of thing with a very flat top of the field where you wouldn't have needed 30 or 35 to win. You might have been able to sneak out of there with 20-something, which, by the way, 20-something was enough to win the primary this year after all. Tulsi's other problem is there was a certain point where people that were between Bernie and Tulsi decided that Tulsi had not moved up enough to not feel like they were throwing away their vote. And a Bernie, Tulsi, Yang voter, and there's a lot of that, they did not want Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg to win the primary, right? Unfortunately, it's not just who you're for, it's also who you're against. And the 3 people that did by far the best were Bernie, Pete, and Klobuchar. And I think you can imagine most people that were like your Bernie, Tulsi, Yang kind of people are not Pete and Amy people. It's a very different kind of vibe for most of them. And when they saw Amy going up and Pete sort of stabilizing, and it became a decision about like, would you like Bernie to beat them or would you like one of them to win? That definitely hurt Tulsi and Andrew at the margins in their own numbers.
Jacqueline, did you have something you wanted to ask Steve?
Yes, just a short question. Given the fact that there's a considerable swath of the country that doesn't even have access to broadband internet, and Andrew Yang basically arose like a phoenix from the ashes from the internet. If you could have a do-over, would you think there would be a way that you could alter the logistics a little bit to get Andrew Yang in front of people who otherwise would not know about him, such as people in the outlying areas of Erie County, Pennsylvania, where I live? There's chunks of our county that are still on dial-up because the infrastructure for broadband does not exist yet.
I think
What
in
are your thoughts
hindsight,
on that?
yeah, from like a political, how do you reach people that were not going to be internet first kind of people? In hindsight, if we're being honest about it, because Andrew was starting from an unprecedentedly anonymous place, like in history, and even getting to the debate stage, raising all the money, all that, what he probably needed to do, which is sort of what Biden did in South Carolina. I mean, Biden tanked in Iowa by what he, his expectations. He kind of tanked in New Hampshire, and he didn't do that well in Nevada. But he had a state with a very strong base, the African-American community in South Carolina stuck with Joe through the worst days electorally. And he crushed it. And as you all know, within 2 weeks, Joe had cleared the field, pretty much. Andrew, I think this goes back to what I would argue would be a New Hampshire strategy, where Andrew was going to have to pick one state, crush it, probably win it outright. And I think New Hampshire, because it's a small state with a plurality of undeclared voters, that I think is the right match for an outsider. If he had done that in New Hampshire and won with 26%, I think it would have boomeranged into Nevada, which we thought was the second best early state. And I think he could have finished second. I think Bernie was going to win that. And then South Carolina was almost always going to be a weak state for him for a bunch of reasons. It just, the match wasn't great. And that would have put him in a position on Super Tuesday where the amount of earned media, free media attention, and the amount of new fundraising that would have allowed him to advertise on TV and so forth, it would have taken that kind of very specific path. Now, I don't know in 2020 in hindsight that Andrew was ever going to be able to get quite to that point this election cycle. It would have required things that did not happen and that maybe couldn't have happened this cycle. But I do think that the next time he runs, and I do think there'll be a next time, that he will start from a stronger place, which means he will not have to spend so much of the first several months of his candidacy scraping to do, any digital platform that'll have him. At the beginning, he didn't have the money to go to Erie County. He didn't and nobody would have him. You know what I mean? Like he was not. People didn't take him as even a candidate. He had to get to a place where he could do that, and by then the money was good, but it wasn't good enough to do a national strategy. And that meant, I think, putting your chips in a state that would have boomeranged him. And I think New Hampshire was his best shot. In 2024 or 2028, he'll start from a much better fundraising base and a name ID, where I think he'll be in a position to be able to spread nationally early to places beyond the first 4 states. Unfortunately, that's an 8-year strategy and not a 4-year strategy. So I don't know that somebody that started as anonymous as him could have been able to do it that way. He needed to focus on the early states, and they needed to work out to create the boomerang effect that Biden got. And I'm not sure. I don't know if that's a great answer, but I think that's the only answer.
We have another couple of guests that are coming in a little while. We're starting another thing at 1:30, and we've had a really good time talking with you. The last thing I wanted to end on is we appreciate all this. Yeah.
He can stay on, or does he just have it?
If he'd like to stay on, I suppose. Why not?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to. Unfortunately, I'm a dad. I mentioned I have 2 teenage daughters. Probably right around what is, I guess, 2:30 my time, right? 2:30 my time. I actually have a responsibility involving my younger daughter. I told her I might be a few minutes late, but that'll already be. So I'd love to come back on, but I probably have to adhere to that.
Okay.
Right. It's important to keep your word to your children. Steve, we've had a really enjoyable time hearing about your analysis of how things went. One of the things that we're really looking for, though, is a way to have a responsive government, especially now with what's happening with the police force doesn't seem to be, executing the will of the people. And so we're looking at, if we go into 2024 to do another campaign, a lot of us burned ourselves out on this last 2020 campaign. We worked so hard, we nearly collapsed from the exhaustion, and then along came coronavirus, and we were like, okay, we have to keep going. And then along comes George Floyd, and we're like, we have to keep going. So the sustainability for us to continue our activism really relies on our feelings and stuff being respected and heard by the campaign itself. And because of during campaigns, you have this independent expenditures people, funding certain people, and they're not allowed to communicate almost. We've had a significant communications problem, I think, in the Yang Gang campaign. And so we'd like to see how that will be addressed in the future. And I wanted to say that I had heard that there is some sort of project now to develop a citizens portal, which relates to this more responsive government, where we have to sort of pioneer this system of getting the bureaucracy to listen to us, and getting the because the legislature is just too slow in this time of instant texting. So if you wait for the legislators to get through their gridlock and go through their years of talking about something and then finally make a decision, it's like 3 years too late. So we're wondering, I'm wondering how to participate in that. Do you know anything about what's going on with that?
I don't. Are you referring to the portal? I know Andrew had mentioned, I think on Twitter.
Something about, yeah.
If I understood it right, and I've not talked to him about it, it sounded like it was from a bureaucratic or governmental perspective. I think it was a one-stop accessible location where all the elements of government that involve your name could be reviewed in a single place, which theoretically would also save a lot of bureaucratic red tape and money and errors, because you could actually have everything in the system talking together and homogenizing into one place. That's how I understood it. I have not talked to him about it. I thought you might also be referring to what can we do politically, which is very different from government bureaucracy, that UBI, Social Security benefits in one place.
Well, I'm thinking about like when we go to run that next campaign, which we're all saying, Andrew's already said he's going to go for 2024. We can't repeat the mistakes of this last campaign where we had trouble communicating upwards, right? Because Andrew was kept so busy running so many events and doing things, he didn't have time to listen. I think that happens to most politicians. And so we would like to find out if we can pioneer that within our group, and also take that to, a general, how does the government respond to the people? If we can figure out how to do that in our group, then we can take it another step.
The short answer, at least as I think a little about it, is I think that the next time Andrew runs, it will be much more of a national effort. It will not just be an early state effort.
Can you guys hear me at least?
Oh, I hear somebody.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, there we go. And that includes not the early states. And by the way, Iowa is probably not going to be first anymore anyway. By the way, they kind of messed that one up. So I don't know what the map's going to look like. I think organizing people within subset regions of states and at a state level early, like by 2021, getting it going in a meaningful way, and having methods of communication that have some form of, at the most local level, clear chains of communication with point people that could be identified that are reliable to talk to at each level. There's an accountability that comes with that. And something that I would certainly recommend to Andrew or any organization is, I really do think, by the way, it's important to have some paid staff. They don't have to make it, be retire early kind of pay. But in order for people to be able to dedicate all their time to do the administrative and bureaucratic work that is not sexy, but is necessary to organize volunteers, there's going to have to be in, all 50 states, some skeletal professional staff that can be the point person for all the volunteer energy that needs a place to go. There needs to be, if we just rely on people that are going to do it out of the largesse of their time and their passion, and there's no ability to take all the resources that we put in places like Iowa and New Hampshire and spread that out in a way that allows you to start building real organizations that can organize volunteers in a way. I mean, this is kind of what Bernie did. Pete, to his credit, Pete wasn't exactly my cup of tea, but Pete did that pretty well. That's how a 37-year-old mayor of South Bend could basically have organization in almost all 50 states. There are things we can learn from what worked in those campaigns and apply them to the unique energy and talent that we had in our campaign, so that you don't professionalize everything to the point where it's stilted, but it's got to be organized enough that people feel like if they can take their ideas and their time and their work, and it's organized enough that you can see results for that work. And that requires some level of paid, accountable staff that can work full time and not think about anything else in their life except to work with volunteers and making that work productive. That's what the best run organizations are able to do. And that's an element of what we're going to have to do in the future. And we got to do it in all 50 states. Early, very early.
Thank you very much for joining us. I see that some of our panelists are coming in for our next discussion. If anybody wants to introduce yourselves very quickly, but we should probably get ready for our next chat. So do we want to do like a quick intro for the new people?
We'll say hello when Ro Khanna comes in, so we can let him know who we are very quickly. So yeah, Steve Marchand, thank you so much for coming on. This was a fantastic conversation. We're so honored to have you here, and we learned a lot. This was great. And yeah, so
well, thank you guys very much. Anytime, stay in touch, get ready for the next one, because it's coming.
We are ready. We do this every week.
Time to grow another 10 times.